Latest collection of essays, A Power Governments Cannot Suppress. This talk from Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, is just over an hour.
You know, Howard came and read here about a year and a half ago for us, and not long after he read, I picked up a book called World Beware about the current state of American politics, written by a man who coined the phrase counterculture. And I found out that he couldn't find a single publisher in the United States to pick up his book. There was not anyone who would touch it. I think people get the impression that as long as books like If I Did It by O.J. Simpson can get published, anything can get published. And it's not the case. So tonight we're here to celebrate something very, very fortunate, that books like this can be published. A Power Governments Cannot Suppress can be published by amazing presses like City Lights, and we can hear the voice directly of some of the greatest statesmen living in the United States today, some of the greatest intellectuals, and I'm proud to introduce one of them now. Please welcome Howard Zinn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, whoever you are who applauded. If you didn't applaud, thanks anyway. Alex is from Backpages Books, right here on Moody Street in Waltham, and they're responsible for this. And I want to thank them. They're struggling, I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, but they are. They're a struggling little bookstore, and they need support like all struggling little bookstores. And you know, I think that we need to direct people more to bookstores and to libraries, away from television, away from the newspapers. I say away from television, even though I know there's a television camera focused on us right now. The question is, will they turn us off as a result of this? No, this is different. This is special. And so yeah, this book, A Power That Governments Cannot Suppress, a man named Greg Ruggiero decided on this book. I didn't really write the book. I wrote the stuff that's in it. And he put it together. That is, there's a bunch of essays. It's a bunch of essays that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, many of them for the Progressive magazine, some of them here and there. I did an essay on Thoreau for Princeton University Press. I did an essay on Eugene Debs. Oh, those two go together, don't they? Yeah. And a kind of socialist and anarchist. I haven't done anything on any Republican that I know of, but anyway, you'll find all sorts of things in this book, things that even surprise me when I find it's there. So, but the basic idea of the book, I don't read, you know, they always talk about these things as somebody's going to do a reading. I never read from my books. I don't think they're worth it. I mean, I'll read from Tolstoy or Thoreau or Mark Twain, but no, I read from my, you know, then you're stuck with it. Whereas if you pick up the book and you read something of mine, you can immediately put it down if you like and go on to something else. So I won't read from my book, but I'll try to tell you something about what's in it, or at least, you know, what is suggested by this book. Fundamentally, the book tries to make a connection between history and what is going on today. That's always been my attitude as a historian. Right? I've never been interested in just doing history to go into the archives and look up these old letters and documents. It's interesting, of course. It's fun. But no, that's not the kind of history I wanted to do. I wanted to go into history and come out into the present. I wanted to make a connection between something that happened in the past because I wanted history to help us in dealing with the situation we face today. And we're always facing a situation today, especially today, especially now with an administration that has taken us into 2 wars in a few years, with an administration that has run amok with power, that has attacked the constitutional rights of people all over this country, an administration that has wasted the enormous wealth that this country has on war and on funneling this wealth into the upper richest 1% of the population, an administration that has taken power unto itself and will not listen to anything that anybody says except maybe 4 or 5 people around the president. So we're in a situation now where we, I think, desperately need to learn something from history, because I feel that if people of the United States at that moment when George Bush got up before the microphone and said, you know, we must go to war, 9/11 took place, terrorist act took place, and therefore we must go to war against Afghanistan. Well, if people listening knew history, they would not immediately rush, as most Americans did at that point. 80% of Americans rushed to say yes, yes. Congress, of course, rushed to say yes, because that's the job of Congress, to say yes whenever the president wants to go to war. And but if people knew some history, there would not be that rush to support a war. There would not be that acceptance of the idea, oh, we're going to war to fight terrorism. There would not be an acceptance of the idea, we're going to war to bring democracy to Iraq, bring democracy to the whole Middle East. Because if people knew some history, they would know of all those instances in the American past when presidents have come before the public and said, well, as President Polk did in 1846, we've got to go into Mexico to spread civilization to the Mexicans. Or as McKinley did in 1898, oh, we've got to go to Cuba to liberate the Cubans. We're always liberating somebody. But we went into Cuba and we liberated the Cubans. In fact, we did. We liberated the Cubans from Spain, but not from us. And that's our record. Our record is sometimes liberating people from other tyrants and then imposing our will on them. So the Spanish were out of Cuba in 1898, and American corporations and American military were in Cuba and stayed there for a very long time, dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship, supported by the United States. If people knew some of that history, if they knew the history of the American occupation of the Philippines, they would be very wary of an American occupation of Iraq. They'd be very wary of the idea, oh, we're occupying Iraq so that we can bring democracy to Iraq. We fought a bloody war in the Philippines. We committed massacres in the Philippines. And then we occupied the Philippine Islands for 50 years. And did we bring democracy to the Philippines? We brought dictatorship after dictatorship and misery to the Filipino people, about 500,000 of whom had died in the war that we waged against the Filipinos. And of course, the history then into the 20th century, into the Marines going again into the Caribbean. General Smedley Butler, I advise you to look General Smedley Butler up, a Marine general who won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, leading the military into various countries in Central America. And at a certain point, he stopped and turned around and said, you know, I was an errand boy for Wall Street. He realized that what he had done, what the American military had done in Central America, was to try to make Central America, the various countries in Central America, in the Caribbean, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in Nicaragua, in Honduras, to make them profitable places for American corporations, not places where democracy would flourish. In fact, democracy did not flourish in all of those places where we sent the Marines to take over and to do the bidding of American economic interests. And of course, bringing the history up to more recent time, if people even studied closely the history of the Vietnam War, that wasn't that long ago, was it? There are actually people here who remember the Vietnam War. despite the attempts of the media to forget the Vietnam War, despite the attempts of our political leaders. You know, when we went into Iraq the first time in 1991 and won this quick, smashing victory, a splendid little war, just like the Spanish-American War, a very quick, victorious war. And George Bush said, Senior, that's the smarter one. George Bush Senior said, well, we have now buried the Vietnam syndrome in the sands of the Arabian Peninsula. Rare poetic statement out of the White House. Well, the fact is we have not buried the Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam is coming back to haunt us. And people are thinking about that more and more every day. And if people remembered Vietnam, they would remember how the calls for withdrawal that came early on. I must say, in 1967, 2 years after we were escalating the war, in 1967, I wrote a book. I love to advertise my books. I'll try to resist it later on, but I can't resist this one. In 1967, I wrote a book called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. And mine was, I must say, the first book. There had been a number of books on the war in Vietnam, and mine was the first book that called simply for the United States to get out, not equivocating, not setting timetables, not saying we'll get out if and when. We're not going to go to Paris and negotiate for 5 years or 6 years. We just have to get out. And the arguments against that at that time were the same as the arguments today when people say, as I say, and as a number of people have said, as Congressman Murta, a Vietnam veteran, said, right? Said, no, we must just leave. We don't belong there. It's not our country. Get out of there. Let the Iraqis determine their own destiny. As difficult as it will be, but we are making it more difficult by our occupation. And the arguments then were the same. Well, we can't do that. There'll be chaos. There'll be chaos in Vietnam? There was chaos in Vietnam. We were bombing Vietnam into eternity. We were destroying Vietnamese villages. We were destroying their land. We were killing their people. Ultimately, 2 million people died in Vietnam, and we mustn't leave because there'll be chaos in Vietnam. So we stayed. We didn't leave. In 1967, when a few of us were calling for withdrawal, we stayed, and what was the result? Another 30,000 American dead, another million Vietnamese dead. And so the same arguments today resonate. Oh, we mustn't leave Iraq, as if our presence in Iraq is preventing civil war. The question is our presence preventing civil war, or is our presence provoking civil war? And I think the answer is clear, just looking at a history of these 4 years of our occupation in Iraq. Iraq is a mess after 4 years. And the numbers of Iraqi dead and wounded are enormous, into the hundreds of thousands. So yes, the history is useful. Not the history that you get in the traditional textbooks, but the history that a citizen learns for himself or herself when a citizen goes to the library, or when a citizen listens to the independent media, when a citizen reads alternative journals instead of simply, watching CNN, and Fox News. So yes, history is very useful. It still is today, and I think that one of the things we might learn from history, and this is a very, very important conclusion to get from the long history of this country, is that the government's interests are not necessarily the same as ours. In fact, are rarely the same as ours. Because if you think the government's interests are the same as yours, then you think, well, if something is going wrong, it must be that they made a mistake because they really care about us. They don't care about us. The government does not care about its own soldiers. If it did, it would not have sent its soldiers into the quagmires of Vietnam and Iraq. It would not send them into a situation where they're going to come back maimed or without arms or legs, or they come back with their psyche destroyed if they really cared about the soldiers and cared about the families of the soldiers. It would not be taking the wealth of this country and squandering it on $500 billion this year on a military budget. That's a hard thing to grasp, that the government does not have the same interest as us. It's hard to grasp because we grow up in a culture where the language of the culture predisposes us to think, yes, we have a common interest. The Constitution starts off in a preamble, we, the people of the United States, establish this. It wasn't we, the people, who established the Constitution. It was 55 rich white men who established the Constitution. I know you're not supposed to say anything about the Founding Fathers. They're our fathers. We're all one family. Not so. The Founding Fathers were slaveholders and merchants and bondholders, really. And sure, they set up a government that was more democratic than other governments of the world. They set up a government that was independent of England, but did not set up a government that was a government of the people. They set up a slave-holding government that was going to do the interests of the bondholders and the merchants. The interests of the government and the interests of the people right from the beginning were not the same. And that same difference of interest has continued down to the present day. All through look at the history of legislation in this country. It's class legislation. It's legislation that has always benefited the upper classes. There's always been subsidies for the corporations and subsidies for the railroads. They didn't call it welfare. When the government began helping poor people, they called it welfare. When the government gave hundreds of millions of acres of land to the railroads, they didn't call that welfare. But the legislative history of this country is a history of legislation favoring the rich, to put it bluntly. And there were some breakthroughs, there were some oddities, there were some moments in history when this was not true. In the 1930s, something happened. In the 1960s, something happened. What happened is that people rose up all over the country and demanded change. And the demands grew so loud and so threatening that then, in the 1930s, we got Social Security and we got unemployment insurance and we got subsidized housing. And in the 60s, we got Medicare and Medicaid. So there have been moments in our history when the people and their desires and their anguish over their situation has broken through. And then we got legislation that moved away from the traditional upper class legislation of the government. But it is extremely important to understand this conflict of interest between government and us. Otherwise, you will think, and the young guy going off to war will think, well, Bush's interest is the same as mine. It's not. Nor is Exxon's interest the same as mine. Nor Halliburton's interest the same as mine. No. That's a very important thing to learn, I think, from history. And when you study the history of the United States, you do not see the kind of country that we all learn about when we go to school, which is a kind of exaltation of America. We're not different, by the way, than other countries. Countries everywhere teach their history in a nationalist way. They're all prideful of their flag and their anthem and, their history. And the United States is no different, except that we're bigger and better and stronger. But we grow up in this country singing the Star-Spangled Banner and, liberty and justice for pledging allegiance and all of that. We grow up with the idea that we are special, we are different. We are the Boy Scouts of the world. We help countries across the street. We're good. We have our little problems, like slavery, maybe. Maybe we weren't nice to the Native Americans. You know, we have our little problems, but basically we're okay. Well, when you look at the history of this country, we were not. We were not. We destroyed Indian civilizations. We expanded into the Caribbean. We expanded into the Pacific. We sent our young people to war again and again. We did not take care of poor people. When poor people organized, when workers organized into unions and went out on strike, the government called out the police and the National Guard and the Army to suppress their strikes. That's the history of labor struggles in this country. So it's not the kind of glorifying history that too many of us, you know, grew up with. And when I say that, and when anybody says something like that, there's a kind of fear of saying it. You're putting down our country. You're unpatriotic. No, I'm not putting down our country when I am honest about what our government has done. I'm putting down our government, yes, but there's a distinction between the government and the country. That's a very fundamental principle of democracy, that the government and the country are not the same. The government and the people are not the same. That's the basic idea of the Declaration of Independence, which says governments are set up by the people. They're artificial creations. They're set up to achieve certain ends, the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, equality. And when governments become destructive of those ends, according to the words of the Declaration of Independence, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. That's serious. Those are revolutionary words. But after all, it was a revolution. And there's something about a revolution that brings out some honesty and also brings out the idealistic language and hopes and dreams which may not be realized. Because, no, the dream of the Declaration of Independence was not realized, but it's there. It's telling us that governments are not to be obeyed simply because they're governments. To be patriotic is not to simply do what the government says. To be patriotic is to subscribe to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, to check up on the government to see if it really is fulfilling its obligation to take care of our right to equality, to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Patriotism, in the best sense of the term, means following those principles. And when the government doesn't follow those principles, the government is being unpatriotic. So we must be honest about ourselves, about our history, about the history of our government. And I think that maybe we need some confession on the part of our government leaders, an acknowledgement, you know, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, where they get up before, you know, and confess, yeah, maybe, you know, Cheney and Bush and the others should get up, you know, form a group called Imperialists Anonymous, and tell the truth, and that is what they're aiming for in the Middle East is not democracy and not liberty. And they don't really care about the overthrow of tyrants like Saddam Hussein. Our government has supported tyrants all over the world. No, what they really care about, it's hard to say this, isn't it? Oil. It seems so mean, so cheap, although the oil won't be cheap. But it seems, you know, really it's just oil? Yes, it's oil. History comes in handy there. The history of American policy towards the Middle East has been based on the desire to control the oil resources of the Middle East. That's been true ever since the end of World War II. Ever since President Roosevelt got together with Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, and they made a deal. The United States will replace the old oil powers, the Dutch and the British and the French in the Middle East. And in return, the United States will support the Ibn Saud government. Talk about democracy. The Ibn Saud government, the Saudi government, government of Saudi Arabia, all these years has been as far from democracy as you can find. But we did not invade Saudi Arabia to give democracy to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia gives us oil and is our ally in our quest for oil in the Middle East. So yes, history is very useful, in all of these ways, and I guess our problem is once we accept what the reality is, once we look honestly at what we have done and what we're doing, and the question is, what do we do about it? And are we helpless to do anything about it? Because I think that's a great problem, that people, even when they oppose the government, feel helpless to do anything about it. And so we don't see today, although most Americans today are opposed to the war, and most Americans today are opposed to the Bush policies, we don't see a connection between that opposition and any kind of change in policy. We don't see the wishes of the people represented in what the government does. We are not seeing the kind of actions that took place during the Vietnam War, where the passive opposition to the war became more than passive when it became civil disobedience. We're seeing the beginnings of that with soldiers who are refusing to go back to Iraq. We are. We're seeing the beginnings of that with the families of soldiers saying, no, we are opposed to this war. But the fact is, we do not have democracy in foreign policy. That's a very important thing to acknowledge, because we're always talking about bringing democracy everywhere else. We do not have democracy in this country when it comes to foreign policy. We learn in school we have 3 branches of government, and we have checks and balances, and the legislator will check the executive, and the Supreme Court will see if things are constitutional or not. That doesn't work in foreign policy. The president decides on war, and Congress goes along like a bunch of sheep. Really, that's what they did in the Mexican War, that's what they did in the Spanish-American War, that's what they did in World War I, that's what they did in the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Did members of Congress know where the Gulf of Tonkin was when they voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? Did they know what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? Turned out to be a mess of lies. But they immediately voted to give Lyndon Johnson the authority to launch what then became a very long war in Vietnam. There's no democracy in matters of foreign policy. And no checks and balances. No hope that Congress will stop and say, hey, let's look into this. Let's see if this is true. And no. And no hope for the Supreme Court deciding that a war is unconstitutional. And we have not fought a constitutional war since the end of World War II. Constitution requires that Congress declare war. Congress has not declared war in any war that we have fought, of the many since World War II. Well, you learn in school, if something is unconstitutional, it's the job of the Supreme Court to say so and do something about it. No. After all, so who are the Supreme Court? Just because they wear black robes doesn't give them any special moral standing. They are political appointees, and they do the bidding of the people who appointed them. So if they don't have democracy in the upper reaches of government, if we can't depend on checks and balances on representative government, that, well, obviously, I think, leads us to the thought that if we're going to have democracy, it depends on us, it depends on the people. Historically, that's been the situation. Historically, when working people found out that the government is not going to do anything about the 12-hour day, they organized, they went out on strike, and they won the 8-hour day. When black people in the South saw that the government, not just the state governments, but the national government, was not going to do anything about racial segregation or brutality in the South, then black people organized, they demonstrated, they went to prison, they were beaten, some of them were killed, but they created a national commotion which finally brought democracy alive. And that's the situation we're in today. We need to bring democracy alive today, and it requires the actions of ordinary people. And we mustn't despair about the fact that the government has all the power. The government has the FBI. They have all their secret apparatus. they are watching us. I don't think I'm paranoid. They really are watching us. And they love that. So our job is to watch them. And we have to understand that despite all the trappings of government which indicate that they are all-powerful, they have the military, they have the money, they have the security apparatus and so on, fact is, historically, and here's where history comes in handy, the most powerful governments have had to change policy when the people demanded it. When an outcry grew so great, when the pressure from below grew so great that it became threatening to the government, then the government had to change policy. We have seen governments toppled. We have seen tyrannies toppled all over the world that seem to be impregnable. You know, in the Philippines, suddenly a dictatorship. Marcos is totally in charge. He wakes up one morning and there are 1 million people in the streets. He leaves. Really, this has happened in place after place. In Haiti, Duvalier jumps on a plane, quick, get out of here, because the people are rising up. The fact is, governments, like all powerful entities, are vulnerable. The government needs people to obey it in order to keep power. When people stop obeying, the government loses its power. Corporations need people to work for it. When people stop working for corporations, then the corporation is helpless. We saw this in the 1930s, General Motors and Ford, huge corporations. We're not going to have a union here. But when the workers left the factories, or even when they sat in the factories and wouldn't let production go on, General Motors was helpless. And so it's important to keep in mind that the power of the establishment rests on our obedience. When we start disobeying, and that's where Thoreau comes in, and that's where the great people in our history come in. That's where Helen Keller comes in, and Emma Goldman comes in, and Mark Twain comes in, and Eugene Debs, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Martin Luther King. That's where they come in. When that happens, then something will change. And our job is to participate in that process. At this point, to light a fire under these wishy-washy Democrats who have just won an election and who are sort of falling back timidly, and they want to pass non-binding resolutions. How about a binding resolution? How about, yes, you know, how about holding hearings on impeachment? Impeachment. I'm talking about a double impeachment. I'm talking about Bush and Cheney because, you know, they go together. And no, impeachment is not a radical solution. Some people act as, oh, impeachment. They tremble at the thought of impeachment. Some people up, you know, in the high reaches of the Democratic Party, oh, we mustn't talk about impeachment. Impeachment is a constitutional measure. It's right there in the Constitution. The president may be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. What Bush has done, does that not match the requirement of high crimes and misdemeanors? Sending us into war, lying to us, taking away our liberties, taking away the lives of thousands of Americans and subjecting so many of them to mutilation and a terrible future. Does that not meet the requirement of high crimes? We have to talk to our congressmen or congresswomen. We have to talk to them, let them know how we feel. We have to beef them up and stiffen their spine and tell them to get going because it's a situation that cannot be tolerated for too long. I have to stop soon because I have to give you a chance. And although the orthodox definition of free speech is that the speaker speaks for 50 minutes and gives the audience 5 minutes. Freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means, the president can speak to 14 30 million people. I can speak to a few hundred. It's a free country. Keep this in mind about power, and keep this in mind about when the government says, when Bush says, oh, we will not retreat. We will not give in. We will stay the course no matter what. Oh, they ask him, what about the people? What about the fact that most people are opposed to this? Well, that doesn't bother me. Well, we've seen that in history. We've seen people say, oh, I will never yield. I will never give in. And they gave in. When enough people got together, when enough people organized, they gave in. We've seen that again and again. I remember George Wallace getting up before a crowd of his Southern supporters and saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and wild applause. 2 years later, the segregation signs were down in the South, and Wallace was campaigning in the black neighborhoods for support in his presidential race. Things change. Things change. It's up to us to move that change along. It's up to us to bring democracy alive. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
We're going to take questions for about a half an hour. There are 2 microphones up here. If you can line up in the side aisles if you have a question, and we'll just go back and forth between the microphones, starting with this one and then to that one, and go for a half an hour, and then we'll do book signings. So if you have questions, feel free to come on up to the aisles.
As you know, I came from Mansfield, Ohio, just to ask you this question, so I'm trying to make it good. And I took off the Yankees hat, so. Being a community organizer and a student citizen, I just was asking for some advice as far as how do we stem the tide of cynicism and apathy, you know, to keep that from breaching the levees of the optimism that you exude in other politicians or people like myself or other people who really care about things that's going on.
Yeah. How do we stem the tide of cynicism and pessimism and hopelessness and all the things that all of us feel on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday? And I think the key to that is, well, there are 2 keys to that, I think. One is history. One is going back and pointing to those times in the past when people have felt hopeless and people have felt that they couldn't do anything, but they acted anyway. And they acted and acted and acted, and then something happened. I mean, that's what happened. I lived in the South for 7 years during the years of the Civil Rights Movement. And I remember when I came into the South in the late 1950s, there was no sign, really, no really important sign of a great movement. And it looked kind of hopeless. But people began to do things. People began sitting in. And then the sit-in spread. And people went on the freedom rides. And the idea spread. And the demonstrations took place in this city, in that city, in another city. And soon the demonstrations were all over the South. And thousands of people were being put in jail. And the pictures were now going out all over the world. And the administration was becoming embarrassed. This is very important, to embarrass the people in power. Even though, you know, we have leaders who are not easily embarrassed. You know. But that I think, is one answer to the question, and that is to show the history of those times when people have felt helpless. So at the beginning of the Vietnam War, and I remember this very distinctly, 1960, spring of 65, beginning of the escalation of the war, we had a demonstration on the Boston Common against the war. 100 people showed up. And a few years later, well, October 69 actually, another anti-war meeting on the Boston Common, 100,000 people were there. The movement grew, it grew and grew because people didn't give up, people persisted, and people understood that all movements start small and all movements start with a kind of hopelessness and a feeling, you know, what are we doing? But if people persist and persist and persist, there's a chance that something may happen. The other thing, I said there were two, right? So I shouldn't forget the second. Very often this happens in class. You say, I will now tell you the 5 causes of the American Revolution. After number 3, the teacher falters. But I can remember 2. That's as high as I go. And my second point is to overcome cynicism and a feeling of helplessness, surround yourself with active people, people who are doing things. When people don't do anything, it's very easy to get hopeless. When people are acting, even if the action doesn't seem to bring anything immediate, but after all, there's something about resisting the authorities. There's something about speaking your mind, about being honest about what you're doing, even if you don't see any immediate results. There's something about that which is very satisfying and invigorating, and it invigorates other people too.
My question has to do with tonight you brought up civil disobedience and the lack, I guess, of it now. And what makes me curious is why is that? And I just want to, there's people like Aaron Russo, who's a filmmaker who's got a movie out, America, Freedom to Fascism, and they're calling people, big people like that are calling for civil disobedience, but I think there's a lack of civil disobedience because of things like the Patriot Act. People are scared to, you know, do that stuff as they weren't back in the 60s. But is there a connection between, you know, that and the lack of people doing that kind of stuff today? And also, the truth movement for 9/11, is there the Project for a New American Century? I'm sure you're familiar with that. And I'm wondering if they had a plan, and do you think there was this plan before 9/11 happened and a connection? Do you have any feelings on the 9/11 truth movement?
You all know about the 9/11 truth movement? No. I thought there are people, tell me if I'm misrepresenting, which I do. But people very often repeat the questions that they want to hear, not the questions that were actually asked. So, but the truth, 9/11 truth movement, I think is a movement which is very suspicious of what happened on 9/11, suspicious of the official story, and they think that maybe there's another story, and they think that maybe the administration is hiding something serious. Well, frankly, I don't know. You know, I don't know those secrets. I swear I don't. You see. I'll just say this about 9/11. The administration has used 9/11, has used it to scare people and to do what it wanted. What it wanted was to move troops into the Middle East where the oil is. It wanted to set up military bases in the Middle East, and it used 9/11 as a wonderful opportunity. It wasn't going to do anything about terrorism. It's very obvious now to simply follow the events of 9/11 by bombing Afghanistan did not reduce terrorism. In fact, it increased the possibility of terrorism. We have, by our actions in the Middle East since 9/11, largely increased the number of terrorists in the Middle East and in the world, because we have antagonized so many people. When you bomb people, you antagonize them. When you invade people, you antagonize them. You make enemies. You get people angry. And out of the anger of millions of people, a small number of them may become terrorists. So they've used 9/11. To me, that's the important truth about 9/11.
The last speaker mentioned the Patriot Act.
Yes.
In the past couple of weeks, the Bush administration has fired 10 or more top attorneys in the Justice Department, and under a secret provision of the Patriot Act has been replacing them without congressional approval and with basically no oversight. So my question about that is, you mentioned that we should bring people to justice through basically impeachment and such things. What happens though if when the legal system is no longer responsive or refuses to take action or is filled with figureheads that will not act? What can we do then if the actual institution does no longer can deliver that justice that is necessary and needed?
That's a really important question because it represents reality. That is, the reality is that the system of justice is no longer, if it ever was really, something you could turn to be sure that the justice system would protect you and protect your rights. This has only rarely been true in American history. The justice system has been like other parts of the government and generally beholden to powerful interests. And now, worse than ever, and now the Bush administration has taken total hold of the system of justice, and it's using all the federal court appointees on the district court level and the appeals court level. It has the Supreme Court in its hands, partly with the collaboration of the Democratic Party, which caves in instead of fighting the Republican nominees. And so, yes, what do you do when you can't depend on a system of justice to redress your grievances? That's where civil disobedience comes in. That's where popular action comes in. And that's where you go over the heads of the courts and you appeal to your elected representatives, since the people in the Justice Department are not elected, they're not beholden to anybody, they often have lifetime jobs. Your representatives at least have some commitment to represent their constituencies, and that's why the putting pressure on your representatives to be in holding impeachment hearings and to demand cutting off of funds for the war and bringing the troops back as fast as possible. I think that's a way of bypassing a recalcitrant and reactionary justice system.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the U.S. does seem to have used the fear of terrorism really well, and yet the hypocrisy of the current government around defending the terrorists who have been attacking Cuba by putting the Cuban Five in jail for having exposed what they were doing seems like a lesson that people really need to hear about in this country, and yet there's been such silence. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit. I know you wrote a wonderful chapter in a book, Superpower Principles, kind of on the background of U.S.-Cuba relations, but I'm realizing a lot of people don't know about these five guys locked up.
Yeah, that's one of those things that have happened that nobody ever hears about, and people are locked away. And they've been locked away for years. And they're five Cubans, right? You correct me if I'm wrong about any of these facts, because you obviously know. You see, usually the questioner knows more than the replier. And but my recollection, these are five Cubans who infiltrated the sort of the anti-Castro network in Miami because terrorist acts were being committed against Cuba. They have been, in fact, ever since Castro took power. It's not a secret that the United States tried to invade Cuba, that the United States tried to assassinate Castro, that the United States, was engaged in secret terrorist activities against Cuba. And so these five Cubans tried to find out about that, and they were arrested, charged with terrorism, held, I think, for a long time without right to counsel, without the right to see their families. And they're still in prison, right, after years. And so there are these things that go on that so many of them that you never hear about. And the press, of course, you cannot really depend on a major media to report on these things. So we depend on people like you to get up before the microphone and to tell people about it.
I'll tell you what, I'll leave some postcards in the back table if people want to send just notices to their Congress people. There's information on them, and then they can sign them and send them off to Congress, because it's just so egregious. But thank you.
Greetings.
Hi.
My question is more like looking for your input. Looking at George Bush and the way he got into office, I see that a large part of that came from the backing of fundamentalist religious groups. And that their strong desire was to impose their religious beliefs on the legislative process, so that they could change the laws of the country so that whatever their religious beliefs are, that would be what the laws of the country were. And I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on the whole role that fundamentalist religion had to do with putting Bush in power.
Well, we've never really had a separation of church and state in this country, no matter, they talk about it as a principle of American democracy. It's never been real. I mean, the presidents have always taken their oaths on the Bible. The God has always been invoked all the time. Any president who wanted to invade any country has said God told him to do that, because God studies the map and decides where we will invade. And then Bush goes, it's just that Bush has gone farther than anybody else in tying his administration to, in this case, fundamentalist, radical, fanatic Christianity. There's a different Christianity. There's a Christianity which is not fundamentalist. There's a Christianity which is not extremist and fanatic. There's a Christianity which is humanist. And, I mean, look at the Catholic anti-war people. Look at the churchmen who have supported social movements. So, Christianity can be used for good or for ill, and Bush has used it, and the fundamentalist churches have been so closely tied to him as to give him great support. And I think that fortunately they do not command the support of the majority of Christians in this country. Now maybe they have 20% or maybe 25%, but there's always been, well, I shouldn't say always, that's an extreme statement. I'm not an extremist. There has been for a long time a fundamental core of immovable right-wing sentiment in this country, which probably accounts for 25 or 30% of the population. And there's probably little you can do to move them. The problem is to move everybody else. And when you move enough other people who are not transfixed by this pseudo-religious idea that God is on the side of imperial power, you see, then it's possible for religion to play a positive role.
I have one comment and one question. I'm a combat veteran who was abused by his own people while serving in the military, and a lot of us who face similar things tried to go to our congressmen and senators, and they've refused to meet with us. We've also gone to the press, and they refuse to air what we have to say, which brings me to the question, do you have any advice on other ways to get things public? We've tried rallies, and that so far hasn't worked a lot either.
To get things published?
Public, meaning news,
publicized.
and make the congressmen meet with the veterans who've been abused.
Yeah, what happened during the Vietnam War, when congressmen refused to meet with people, the people who tried to meet with these congressmen sat in their offices. They went to see them and they wouldn't leave. I mean, that's an act of civil disobedience. And that brought attention. And that sometimes embarrassed the congressman into finally meeting with them. But when the orthodox channels don't respond, then you have to go outside the orthodox channels. But the orthodox channels do not fulfill the requirements of democracy. So, yeah, there are things that can be done. They're hard. They take risks. You may be very well, may be arrested and so on. But in times of crisis, That's what people do. People did that in the South during the movement there. People did that during the Vietnam War. During the 80s when Reagan was carrying on covert warfare in Nicaragua and Honduras and El Salvador, people committed civil disobedience. At one point, 500 of us sat in the JFK building here in Boston and wouldn't move when the building closed down. They arrested 500 of us. The charge was based on an old statute, you know, and it was abbreviated as, the old statute was like failure to quit the premises, you see, and it was abbreviated as failure to quit. And that's what we have to do. We have to fail to quit. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
A quick question and then a longer question or two. This is driving me nuts. I've been an admirer of you for over 30 years.
So you want to drive me nuts?
I'll try.
Yeah.
Sure, I'm older than many of the people here. 30 years ago when I was in school, we read a book by you. I can't remember the name of it, about Vietnam. And I don't believe it's Vietnam Logic. It's another book. It had like a red, it was a paperback. It had red in it. And I was trying to look for it today. It's driving me nuts that I can't remember the name of it. Because I hope I can find it.
Neither can I.
I know it was written by you, though.
You sure?
My second question is, if I understood you correctly, you were mentioning that government is sort of for the wealthy and the upper. On the other hand, I've heard, not that I'm disputing you, people like Ted Kennedy and maybe Michael Dukakis and others being ones that have been sort of there to help the underdog, the immigrant, somebody that don't have money, giving out free, free food stamps or free way to those people. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
Agree with?
The fact that Kennedy and some of those other people are sort of on the other end of what you were saying, where the government serves the rich rather than
I see.
And thirdly, who do you see as a good president for the next?
Thirdly, I only heard one. You're skipping one. Okay.
The book was the other one.
Oh, the book. Oh, I see. Okay.
Who do you would like to see be our next president?
Who would I like to see our next president?
And the comment
Well,
about the Kennedy.
I'd just soon have a lottery and choose somebody from this audience. And I would gamble that anybody in this audience would probably do a better job than whoever is going to be selected by the Democratic Party. So I'm half serious. But to your question about, what about Kennedy and Dukakis and so on doing good things for the poor? Well, yeah, there are congressmen who are better than other congressmen. There are congressmen who are more liberal, and there are congressmen who have a better idea of what our tax structure should be and so on. And it's nice to have those congressmen. We should encourage them and support them. But they always need to be encouraged. They always need to be pushed. And they are a distinct minority in our system of representation. So as for who I would like to see president, unfortunately, it's very hard to find somebody who in the high reaches of the Democratic Party. When I look at the possible candidates, well, process of elimination, right? Hillary Clinton? No. No. Biden? No. Obama? Possibly. John Edwards? Possibly. But you're putting me in that position, you see, the position that we're always in at election time, where we don't find anybody who really represents our views. We try to find somebody who a little bit represents our views, you see. Ralph Nader would represent my views. And Ralph Nader, you see, but the political system won't give him a chance. You know, it's a sad thing. We talk about bringing democracy to other countries, say, oh, they're having an election. This means democracy. You see, we have elections all the time. Doesn't mean democracy. No. You have two parties and you choose, you know, A or A prime, you say. And that's it. Yes.
Thank you. How you doing, sir?
Hi.
What do you think about government and mental health?
What do I think about government and mental health?
Yes.
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, what can I say? Do I think the government should do more in the area of mental health? Yes. I mean, you know, I think the government should do much more in the way of health. Leaving health and leaving mental health to private enterprise is not conducive to giving people the best medical care, whether it's in physical health or in mental health. So, yeah, I think it would be important for a universal healthcare system where people who have problems in mental health can take care of those problems without spending a lot of money, and where, you know, that kind of help is available to them, and the government can be a kind of intermediary for that process. I don't know what else to say. I don't know that much, you know.
Well, the government seems to overtake funding and grants for mental health. It seems so every year.
It seems to do what?
Every year or so, I've noticed through candidates being elected governor or through the fights, just like gay and lesbian rights, they seem to battle back and forth, and whether they give or take the rights, it seems like we're always economically fighting for them. So it's a give or take war economics-wise as well as politically standing-wise for numbers of candidates who are against or positive. And it seems like the deciding vote always comes up to the one standing in power. I think that when my own political view is that if they were to take away the rights where they already been initiated, that they were a benefit of mankind, why take them back?
Well,
what gives them the right to do so over short notice?
well, all I can say is I think you should find people who agree with you about the mental health situation and organize and campaign for what you believe in. Are we near the end of our rope? I mean, at the end of my rope. Yeah, who are my handlers here? Alex, what is our situation with time? One more question, and we'll do book signing. Okay.
Good evening.
Hi.
I'm a second semester senior here at Brandeis, which means I'll be graduating this May. For the past 4 years, I've been taking courses on justice and liberty and doing case studies on developing nations being taken advantage of by multinational corporations and writing papers about the dominating power of money and interest and this and that. But now it's time to graduate and get a job. And those things are all well and good from behind my desk in my room, but when I look at my job options for next year, realistically, a lot of the things I'm looking at are consulting firms or jobs in the financial world. And I know I have a lot of friends also who are more politically liberal, who are taking jobs in investment banking and fields like this, not necessarily firms that have 30 records human rights wise or something like this, but certainly part of what you're talking about. So someone like me who's more on the fence, I think I'm stuck in an ethical dilemma. I'm not exactly sure, where one goes in this situation. So I don't know if you have 2 minutes to talk me out of working for corporate America. What would you say?
2 minutes to solve your problem? Actually, we all face that problem. We have to make a living, and we want to do something good in the world. and we have to find ways of doing it. Sometimes you can make a living, and in the way you make your living, you could do something good in the world. If you're only a small number of people are lucky enough to be able to do that. You work for a nonprofit corporation, work for Amnesty International, work for a progressive magazine, et cetera, write good stuff and get published and that sort of thing. Some of us are lucky and we can do that. Most people cannot. And so what do most people do? You make a living in whatever way you can, so long as you don't kill people and exploit people fiendishly. But you make a living in whatever way you can, but carve out part of your life and part of your time to be a citizen of the nation and of the world. It's harder. You have to do two things. It's like a woman who has to take care of kids and do a job at the same time. All of us have to do two things at once. And that's the reality of it. Thank you.
Howard Zinn is author of A People's History of the United States. His latest is A Power Governments Cannot Suppress. Learn more at howardZinn.org.
If people of the United States at that moment, when George Bush got up before the microphone and said, we must go to war, 9/11 took place, terrorist act took place, and therefore we must go to war against Afghanistan. Well, if people listening knew history, they would not immediately rush, as most Americans did at that point. 80% of Americans rushed to say yes, yes. Congress, of course, rushed to say yes, because that's the job of Congress, to say yes whenever the president wants to go to war. But if people knew some history, there would not be that rush to support a war. There would not be that acceptance of the idea, we're going to war to fight terrorism. There would not be an acceptance of the idea, we're going to war to bring democracy to Iraq, bring democracy to the whole Middle East. Because if people knew some history, they would know of all those instances in the American past when presidents have come before the public and said, well, as President Polk did in 1846, we've got to go into Mexico to spread civilization to the Mexicans. Or as McKinley did in 1898, we've got to go to Cuba to liberate the Cubans. We're always liberating somebody. But we went into Cuba and we liberated the Cubans. In fact, we did. We liberated the Cubans from Spain, but not from us. And that's our record. Our record is sometimes liberating people from other tyrants and then imposing our will on them. So the Spanish were out of Cuba in 1898, and American corporations and American military were in Cuba and stayed there for a very long time, dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship, supported by the United States. If people knew some of that history, if they knew, doesn't mind my saying this, but they're a struggling little bookstore, and they need support like all struggling little bookstores. And I think that we need to direct people more to bookstores and to libraries, away from television, away from the newspapers. I say away from television, even though I know there's a television camera focused on us right now. The question is, will they turn us off as a result of this? No, this is different. This is special. And this book, A Power That Governments Cannot Suppress, a man named Greg Ruggiero decided on this book. I didn't really write the book. I wrote the stuff that's in it, and he put it together. That is, there's a bunch of essays. It's a bunch of essays that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, many of them for the Progressive magazine, some of them here and there. I did an essay on Thoreau for Princeton University Press. I did an essay on Eugene Debs. Oh, those two go together, don't they? Yeah. And a kind of socialist and anarchist. I haven't done anything on any Republican that I know of. Anyway, you'll find all sorts of things in this book, things that even surprise me when I find it's there. So, but the basic idea of the book, I don't read, they always talk about these things as somebody's going to do a reading. I never read from my books. I don't think they're worth it. I mean, I'll read from Tolstoy or Thoreau or Mark Twain.
Latest collection of essays, A Power Governments Cannot Suppress. This talk from Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, is just over an hour.
Howard came and read here about a year and a half ago for us, and not long after he read, I picked up a book called World Beware about the current state of American politics, written by a man who coined the phrase counterculture. And I found out that he couldn't find a single publisher in the United States to pick up his book. There was not anyone who would touch it. I think people get the impression that as long as books like If I Did It by O.J. Simpson can get published, anything can get published. And it's not the case. So tonight we're here to celebrate something very, very fortunate, that books like this can be published. A Power Governments Cannot Suppress can be published by amazing presses like City Lights, and we can hear the voice directly of some of the greatest statesmen living in the United States today, some of the greatest intellectuals, and I'm proud to introduce one of them now. Please welcome Howard Zinn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, whoever you are who applauded. If you didn't applaud, thanks anyway. Alex is from Backpages Books, right here on Moody Street in Waltham, and they're responsible for this. And I want to thank them. They're struggling. I hope you don't. But no, I read from my, then you're stuck with it. Whereas if you pick up a book and you read something of mine, you can immediately put it down if you like and go on to something else. So I won't read from my book, but I'll try to tell you something about what's in it, or at least, what is suggested by this book. Fundamentally, the book tries to make a connection between history and what is going on today. That's always been my attitude as a historian. Right? I've never been interested in just doing history to go into the archives and look up these old letters and documents. It's interesting, of course. It's fun. But no, that's not the kind of history I wanted to do. I wanted to go into history and come out into the present. I wanted to make a connection between something that happened in the past, because I wanted history to help us in dealing with the situation we face today. And we're always facing a situation today, especially today, especially now with an administration that has taken us into 2 wars in a few years, with an administration that has run amok with power, that has attacked the constitutional rights of people all over this country, administration that has wasted the enormous wealth that this country has on war and on funneling this wealth into the upper richest 1% of the population, an administration that has taken power unto itself and will not listen to anything that anybody says except maybe 4 or 5 people around the president. So we're in a situation now where we, I think, desperately need to learn something from history, because I feel that history of the American occupation of the Philippines, they would be very wary of an American occupation of Iraq. They'd be very wary of the idea, we're occupying Iraq so that we can bring democracy to Iraq. We fought a bloody war in the Philippines. We committed massacres in the Philippines. And then we occupied the Philippine Islands for 50 years. And did we bring democracy to the Philippines? We brought dictatorship after dictatorship and misery to the Filipino people. About 500,000 of whom had died in the war that we waged against the Filipinos. And of course, the history then into the 20th century, into the Marines going again into the Caribbean. General Smedley Butler, I advise you to look General Smedley Butler up, a Marine general who won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, leading the military into various countries in Central America. And at a certain point, he stopped and turned around and said, you know, I was an errand boy for Wall Street. He realized that what he had done, what the American military had done in Central America, was to try to make Central America, the various countries in Central America, in the Caribbean, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in Nicaragua, in Honduras, to make them profitable places for American corporations, not places where democracy would flourish. In fact, democracy did not flourish in all of those places where we sent the Marines to take over and to do the bidding of American economic interests. And of course, bringing the history up to more recent time, if people even studied closely the history of the Vietnam War, that wasn't that long ago, was it? There are actually people here who remember the Vietnam War.